So thank you very much for being here. We have quality, if not quantity, of participants. So a bit about myself. I'm an ex-member of staff, but I still do a lot of things at IDS. And my group was the Rural Futures Group. And my main teaching was in the MSc, Climate Change, Development and Policy, which they can't be here today because they have teaching at the same time. So they have an unfortunate clash. And my work is mainly on rural livelihoods and in the global south, so-called global south, and climate change and the impact of climate change on poor people in the global south and the politics of climate finance. And I will probably do a seminar next term on that topic. I'm also doing one on part 2 of this one is in 2 weeks' time. So this is in 3 parts. There is so much to do in this topic that it's divided into 3. So we will have the next one in 2 weeks and the third one next term. I'm also giving a talk on Thursday this week on concepts in development studies. In particular, this one is on community. Why is community a problem concept in development studies? So you're very welcome to come to that in room 220, I think it is, on Thursday at 1 o'clock. And that is also part of a project which some alumni are doing, which we will explain if you come to that session. Okay, welcome, thank you. So we're going to get straight into it because there's still quite a lot to do in this. And the main goal of this session is to introduce the concept of neoliberalism and what it is, because it dominates the whole world. It dominates international finance, it dominates even the climate change finance, and it dominates national government policies in both the global north and the global south. So we need to understand it if we want to understand development, because it is extremely important as something which determines what you can and cannot do in development. And so that's what we're going to explore today. Zappa's not working. Does it default to off? Okay. Right, now it's working. So we're doing the top part. The order is wrong. This is part 2 here. This is what we're doing today. So the structure is around definitions and how it is an ideology, not an economic theory. That's crucial to understand. It's about faith in markets rather than having an understanding of it being an economic theory. And some examples of neoliberalism in action, some of which were on your doorstep a few years ago. And then why is the terminology so confusing? Because you will find that people, especially in the United States, think that liberals are left-wing and neoliberal is right-wing. So it's very, very confusing terminology. And so I want to uncover that and get some sense of how that's working. And so defining it, I'll leave you to read that because it's really important. You have some kind of definition in your mind. Anything confusing in that definition? Is that clear? Some of you are puzzled. So please, in this session, if there's something that you don't understand, a word or an idea, then say something immediately while the slide is there. If it's more for discussion at the end or questions at the end, then leave it till the end. Has anyone got to leave at 2 o'clock for a class? Okay. Sorry? You have to leave at 1:30. Okay. If you have to leave early, what I will do is I will stop so there's questions, and anyone who has to leave, you'll get a chance of the first questions if you have something. Okay. Is everyone clear about this? Some of you still looking puzzled. Do you want to ask anything about this? Because while it's on the screen, it's important.
The ethic in itself?
The ethics. Well, existing ethical beliefs. One of the things it means there is the idea that capitalism is for the benefit of everyone. Okay. Now, even in German capitalism, the corporation is supposed to look at issues that affect society and the environment, as well as returns to the shareholders. That doesn't exist in British law, but the idea of capitalism in the past was that capitalism was for everyone. Everyone benefited, and that was an ethics. It was an ethical approach to capitalism, but it is undermined by this. Does that make sense? Okay. So as you can see, the emphasis of his definition, and the reason I like it, is that it focuses on the idea that it is a faith and not an economic theory. It is about believing in something even when the proof of it not working is there. All right. Now, how many people in this room would say that the most crucial things we're worried about in development, we might say poverty, healthcare? Yes? I'm not seeing any recognition. How would you define development? I would define it as improving people's access to food, reducing poverty, having access to healthcare, education, and those basic things. We used to call them basic rights or basic needs, okay? And housing, are any of those solved by the market? They can't be. They aren't. Because they operate within a difference in income and wealth, which is created by society. So the most fundamental things which improve people's lives cannot be solved by market mechanisms. And yet neoliberalism says everything can be solved by markets. So it's about a belief, it's a faith, it's a religion, and not an economic theory. That's my point. So here are examples of creating markets that have gone on in the last 200 years. Land transfers, they're not markets. They're imposed by power, and yet people talk about the market for land, but land is seized from people or is privately controlled for the benefit of those who own it. Transferring public services to private ownership, including rail companies, transport companies, water provision, and education. The so-called sharing economy. Does anyone know what Airbnb stood for? Why has it got air in the title? You all know about airbeds. You pump up an airbed and you have friends. So the idea was that you could have somebody come and stay with you, possibly on an airbed, and you would make a bit of money. It was supposed to be the sharing economy. Is it now? No. It's huge, big, multi-billion-pound business, which is enriching serious billionaires. But the idea was it was sharing. You can see how quickly it goes from an idea of equity to an idea of inequity and elitism. Social media, in which we become the product. You all know this, I'm sure. We are the product in social media. They collect our data of what we click on and how we behave in relation to that. And then our profile is then used to target us for adverts, but also for politics, for changing our opinion about who we will vote for. Climate change. This is one of the worst for humanity. The idea that you can solve the problem of too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by having a market in carbon. And I'm not going to have time to go on to this. I hope next time, part 2, we can. But the neoliberals, especially in the United States and the World Bank, influenced the design of climate change policy years ago so that it was based on a market mechanism which cannot work. Biodiversity, protection and restoring through price and market mechanisms, valuing nature, putting a dollar price on nature so that it is able to be valued in a way which will help protect it. Well, you'll see how that goes in a couple of slides next. And the disruption of traditional markets so that the value in those markets can be captured for the benefit of usually of a minority or a corporation or both at the same time. And then capturing common property, non-privately owned resources, and transferring the benefits of those common property, things like forests or wetlands, into private ownership and private profit. So all of these things are supposedly creating markets or operating within markets which are supposed to benefit everyone, but you can see that they do not benefit everyone. They're designed to transfer benefits from the majority to the minority. And so this is a key part of the ideology that's embedded in the neoliberal definition. Here's a lovely one from 2019. I'll just leave you to read that on Twitter. Okay, so I then went to the source of this, which is a blog from a woman who works from the World Bank. This is first-class bullshit. Bhutan's forest covers remained remarkably stable and even increased over the past years. So what are they trying to fix? There's nothing to fix. The forest is fine. Okay? And then isn't it extraordinary? You can see the religion going on in those sentences. That here is a country, it's got forest, only 2% of GDP. So what? If you measure things in GDP, then you will think the solution is to increase GDP when it isn't. So these are quite extraordinary ideological statements, which are very common from the so-called development banks. And that's what we need to be worried about. They're trying to create a market in forests for the products so that the GDP goes up. Now, good luck in making sure that is conserving and sustainably managed. Okay, you get the point. Examples of neoliberalism in action. We are all affected by it, even when we don't know it. And one of the problems is that it has been incremental. It has changed over 40 years, eating away at bit by bit at more and more of society and the economy. So we need to understand that incremental change, because nobody could say it changed overnight. It's taken 40 years to get here, and people of your age have no idea what it was like before. So what I will try to emphasize next time is what it was like before when we did not have neoliberalism. Was life better? We can ask those kind of questions. Okay, so we're all affected by the reduction of regulation for safety issues, inspections of buildings. And underlying this was the idea that we should get rid of the red tape. You all know what we mean by red tape? Bureaucratic procedures which harm progress, okay? And which in many cases are a safeguard for safety and health and well-being. And the nanny state, have you all heard of the phrase, the nanny state? The nanny state was a favorite one in Britain, also to some extent the United States. You all know what a nanny is. So the idea here is that the nanny is the state. The nanny is looking after you as if you're children. And that if you're infantilized, literally by the idea of the nanny state, then it is not a good way for the state to operate. Now, what has been accused of being the nanny state are generally things which protect us from harm and which improve our lives. And we'll give some examples. Another key thing is outsourcing. You all know this phrase of outsourcing. Okay, so allowing private companies to take over aspects of what is going on in an entity. So, for example, in hospitals, a lot of the food is provided by outsourcing. In dealing with prisons and prisoners, the transport of prisoners is organized by private security companies who also run private prisons and migrant centers or asylum centers. And another one, I'm sorry, these are out of order. The neoliberal university, which you're sitting within, is a part of this process it is affected by neoliberalism. So we will come to that. And this involves profit-seeking, cost-cutting, academic knowledge abandoned. So there is a fight going on at a university in Leicester where the management want to get rid of the entire geography department. Sussex last year said we've got to lose 140 academics. No, sorry, that was Brighton University. At Sussex, I can't remember what the number is. But they're getting rid of hundreds and hundreds of academic staff. And that is to cut costs because their only income is from students. And most of you are paying very high fees to come and study in Britain. And so universities are now not educational institutions, they are businesses, they're corporations competing with each other for this. And what that means is that more and more of the teaching is done by junior staff, usually unqualified. Many of them might be PhD students, teaching assistants. 50% of the undergraduate teaching in British universities is done by people who are not proper lecturers. 50%. Same in the United States. And this is a consequence of the way in which the university has succumbed to neoliberal ideology. Boeing crashes, you might remember those. The construction industry. How many of you have heard of Grenfell Tower in London, which burnt down nearly 10 years ago? Okay, we'll come to that. Privatization in Britain, railway corporations. If you go on the train from here to London, you might be on two different train lines, two different train companies, both owned by the same company. There's a big company that owns 3 train lines. Some of those companies are owned by foreign governments and foreign corporations. They're making the profit out of our train system. Not very high profits, but it's a very weird. The ideology of privatization has enabled the Dutch, the Germans, and the French to take over control of British railways because they had the ideology of privatization. So some of the rail companies are owned by foreign governments. Very weird. Water supply, which we'll come on to. This is 2013. Students campaigned against the privatization of the cleaning and the catering, which are now privatized. So the people don't get a proper wage or proper conditions because they're casual laborers, and they don't have, therefore, such a decent life. Now, the students protested, and some were suspended. In other words, they were kicked out of the university. There was an argument they did actually get back in. But I did an earlier version of this talk a few years ago, and somehow or other, I have no idea how, but somebody from Uganda saw it and said, that happened to me. I got kicked out, and he was never allowed in. So he was in, I think, the final year of his medical degree. This is neoliberalism in action, because Uganda was part of the process by which the IMF imposed structural adjustment on governments of the global south. Now, these structural adjustment policies, SAPs, a large part of them was to cut government spending. And if they were spending in education, the argument would be that you won't spend that, but the students will have to pay the fees. So the students protested about this neoliberal approach, and he was kicked out. And we've been corresponding since then because he's still having a terrible life. And he's just one example of what's going on. This is Grenfell Tower on the left, and it burnt down because they put plastic sheeting on the outside of it for a good reason, to try to insulate it so it had better temperature. So it was insulated from the cold, but they used insulation material that was highly flammable. Highly flammable. What happened is, in one flat, a fridge caught fire. I don't know which one, but let's assume it's there. A fridge caught fire. The flames went from that flat to the outside, and quickly the whole building was alight. 72 people died. And the stuff that they used should not have been used. And what happened is, well, that's a friend of mine, his quote on it. So it's a part of the neoliberal thing. And the key findings of the report, which came out last year, the government was warned 25 years before it struck. Fire tests proved how dangerous the cladding was before the cladding was put on the building. So this is a failure of regulation, red tape, not enough red tape. An earlier government ignored the risks. Privatization. This buildings research establishment was created to make sure buildings were constructed safely with safe materials and good quality materials. It was privatized, taken control of by the construction industry. Now, that is not a good basis for having safety, when the industry is controlling the thing that is supposed to monitor safety. And there was deliberate behavior and dishonesty from the people who made and sold the cladding, and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of blah, blah here. And the fire brigade didn't prepare their teams. So it was a product of decades of failure, but the people in the tower knew it was dangerous, and they were campaigning for several years before the fire to have the building made safe. And I think there are 600 other towers in Britain with the same stuff on them. And it's taking years to make them safe. And the people who live in them can't sell them because nobody will buy them while they've got this stuff on the outside. Boeing 737 MAX, 2 crashes. And it's shown that Boeing played around with safety, and there were various people, including engineers, who resigned and explained what was going wrong in the company, pushing to produce the planes too quickly, blah, blah, blah. Weak regulation, links between Boeing and the regulator, too cozy, cost saving, and it cost Boeing $19 billion to pay the legal costs and compensation. These are the, from a few years ago, the British rail system. Can you see how complicated it is? And before they were privatized, there was just one company that ran the whole rail system. Now, you can go on a train. Let's say you get a train from London to Manchester, as I did last week. If you didn't get on the right train, your ticket would not be valid. And you would have to pay again, usually with a fine as well. I mean, this is just crazy, crazy stuff. I'm not going to have time to go through all that. Beaches and water. Have any of you have heard of Surfers Against Sewage? So in Britain, there's an NGO called a civil society organization called Surfers Against Sewage, because they campaign for clean beaches. They want clean beaches so they can surf. Others want beaches to be safe for their children and to swim. And this is the raw sewage affecting beaches in England and Wales in that year. I can't see which year that is. And that's the organization in Brighton. And our local water company in this area was fined for pouring sewage into the sea. 90 million, it's nothing. In their finances, 90 million is something, it doesn't matter. So they carried on doing it. And one of the problems is, do you know this idea of the revolving door? So people from government go into private business, and then some go back from business into government. So they're creating this revolving door where they give secrets, they they combine knowledge, and they tell the company what the government is thinking. And then when they get into the government, they can influence the policy. And so what should you do about this? You should worry about it. Some of them were convicted of criminal criminal cases from this same company, okay? So what does Sussex do? They get one of the senior officials from Southern Water to be on the advisory board of the business school. What good advice might they be able to give? I have no idea if he was involved in any of those things. And we don't know. But the idea that somebody from Southern Water with that record of breaking the law, of doing all of those things deliberately and so on, is an advisor to a business school is somewhat shocking. But then if you look at the rest of the people who are on the business school advisory board, well, I won't go there, but you can look them up on their website. I would say that they are all pro-capitalist and have not almost all. I think there's one from a charity, and they are all looking like they're not very critical of capitalism. So I think this is part of the problem. I like this tweet. We should really stop treating the world's richest people as a hall of fame and start regarding it as a list of suspects. How many of you have heard of Mark Twain, American writer from 120 years ago? This is a very famous quote of his, but it's actually not by him. We don't know who this is by, but it's a very good one. Do any of you remember the 2008 financial crisis and how it was bailed out by government? This is a very good film, The Big Short. I haven't seen the others, but The Big Short is a pretty good film about that crisis. It's still worth seeing. Did the bankers get arrested? No. They did extraordinary things which bordered on criminality, if not actual criminality. And it had a huge effect on 10 million people. Households lost their homes. They lost their homes because the interest rates went up as a consequence of this. They couldn't afford to pay the higher interest rates, so they had to lose their homes. They didn't get bailed out, but the banks got bailed out by hundreds of billions of dollars, but not those 10 million households. So the third part is, why is the terminology so confusing? And I'm not sure if I'm helping with this section. So you must tell me in the discussion whether I'm actually helping at all. So we've done that. We're now moving on to, why is the terminology so confusing? Where does it come from? And you've probably all heard of Adam Smith and his book, shorthand book, name for it, The Wealth of Nations. And this is what we're doing in part 2 in a couple of weeks' time. So we're moving on to this now. Where does the terminology come from? And it's absolutely vital for this, as everything else that you should do, that you understand class. This is all about class in the Marxist sense, or whatever sense you want, some kind of social science approach which understands that the world is organized around class. Okay, those who own things and those who don't own things is the principal division in a very simplistic class structure. Those who own and control production methods, or social media, or telecom companies, whatever. So that is absolutely crucial we understand class. And that is the clue to how we understand this very confusing terminology. So John Locke argued against absolute monarchism. Do you all know what we mean by absolute monarchism? That's the idea that the king or the emperor, usually a king, very occasionally a queen, has the absolute right to rule over everybody. And usually they claim it's a God-given right. This was very common in Europe, but it's also common in Japan, in China, in Thailand, and other parts of the world where the king or the emperor would claim that they were on earth to rule on God's behalf. So you have this alliance between religion and power, which was extremely valuable to the class that was at the top. It was manipulation of people's beliefs to benefit the class which was at the top. So around this time of what is called the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, you have thinkers like Locke who said that this was wrong. They were emerging into different ways of thinking that having an absolute monarch was wrong. And he argued for what was called the social contract between people and government, which would give people a say, a relationship to how the country was run. So it was about the idea that it wasn't run from the top for the benefit of the elite, but it was run by everyone in a socially constructed social contract arrangement. So from around 1760, capitalism generated thinkers who were responding to what's going on. The reality was capitalism was emerging, and people needed to understand what on earth is going on. So you have the beginnings of the social sciences. This is where social science comes. You had philosophy from long before, but social sciences, which understood the economics and the politics, emerges with the Enlightenment around this idea that we have to understand, why is society changing? Before it was feudal, it was countryside, it was agriculture. Now we've got industry, we've got canals, we've got coal power, etc. And so you have the emergence of what was called political economy. And to their credit, they didn't see that there was any difference between politics and economics. And we need to go back to that today. It's a false separation. Economics is determined by who has power and what institutions have power. And so we should be reverting to the idea of political economy. And Adam Smith, around this time, was trying to say, well, why is Britain becoming wealthy as compared with other countries? So his attempt was to try to understand what is the process by which wealth is created. And of course, that meant physical things and what we would now measure with GDP. How was that going on? And what is the relationship between workers and the government? And what are those things there? So this is the emergence of ideas to understand what is going on. Now, Adam Smith, as you probably know, is regarded by many as the founder of the idea of free markets. And that is wrong. He had a much more complicated relationship to markets, as you will see in a minute. But the idea of capitalism at this time was the proposal that everything should be free from government interference. And we use a French phrase for that, which is called laissez-faire, let it happen. Laissez-faire capitalism was the first liberalism. Okay, so this is why the terminology. What we have now is the neoliberalism, which began with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the people who pushed them into this ideology, who we will see in a minute. And that was neoliberalism because it was a revival of this early capitalist liberalism. Okay, you'll edit that out, won't you? Thank you. And so we have this confusion of the terminology. And then the question, which will be next time in 2 weeks' time, what happened in between? What happened that it had to be neoliberalism? What happened in between 1980 and the end of the 19th century, which made life different? The bit you don't know about, okay? Loosely called the welfare state or welfarism or social democracy, capitalism with a human face, whatever you want to call it. It was the idea that 19th century laissez-faire capitalism was horrendous for people, okay? And it was revised, changed, and we'll see that next time. So here is another bit of the class structure. This is classic European feudalism. This is a pyramid or a triangle with the king or the emperor at the top and the aristocracy here, who are obliged to support the king, and they get their land. Their wealth is coming from the land. They use these serfs, the peasants down here, to provide them with their wealth. And then there are the knights, the ones who fight on behalf of the king and the lords to protect the wealth of the minority. And of course, they would raise armies as well. One of the interesting things about this period in Europe especially is that there was no concept of nationhood. Most of the armies were paid armies. You didn't go and fight for Britain or England because you thought England should do this against France or against another country or Netherlands. They were, what do you call it when you have a soldier who is a paid soldier, has no allegiance to the country? Mercenaries. Yes. So most of these armies were mercenaries. You would hire them from wherever you could hire them. And so they weren't actually fighting for a country. And that we will talk about that in 2 weeks as well. Now, so this is a class structure in which the wealth at the top is very easily explained because it is sucked out of the peasants who are farming the land at the bottom. Okay, and this is a very unfair system, but it is maintained by the religious system, which grants the power to the people. And because most of the people are rather superstitious and willing to believe in that, they may be actually quite happy to go along with the belief because they think that will keep them safe. Okay, so that was also a point of contention because what happened is that under classic European feudalism, it was under pressure from different class interests. It was not stable. They were always juggling around, some people trying to get a slice of the money over above other class interests and so on. So what we witnessed from European feudalism into capitalism is a transition from one mode of production to another in which new class interests emerged and some were suppressed. And along this, there were three types of ideas of liberty or freedom. Liberalism. So your flavor of liberalism depended on your class interest. And that is the whole point about why the language is so complicated and confusing, because you will still today have people in the United States who think that liberalism is both a free market, but a liberal is a left-wing or even a communist. It doesn't really work. And that's because over those 300 years, the word liberal has become so confused as to what it means. Now, we have a very clear idea here of what we mean by neoliberalism. That was from the start of the talk. But this confusion is because in this emergence from feudalism, we had different groups who wanted to use the word freedom or liberal for different reasons. Okay, so one group wanted the freedom to set up enterprises. They wanted to be entrepreneurs, what we would now call capitalists or the bourgeoisie. And so these were the emerging capitalists, the bourgeoisie, as they were also called. And they had a particular definition of liberalism and freedom, which served their interests. They did not want to be controlled in this system. They did not want a hierarchical system in which they could not operate freely because the feudal system made it extremely difficult to do that. They wanted a different system to set up their enterprises free of the control of the feudal structures. That's one definition of freedom and liberalism from them. Then you have the emergence of what I've, for shorthand, called the rights of man approach and democracy. And this is for ordinary people who also don't think they should have to live in this feudal hierarchy. So how do you change that feudal hierarchy into something different, which enables ordinary people to live their life by defining how they want to be? And it is through the idea of democracy. And that is summed up in the idea of the rights of man, which was written by a man who lived in Lewis in the 1770s. And very interesting history there. There's a little museum about him there. He wrote The Rights of Man. He influenced the American Declaration of Independence, and he also became elected to the French Parliament and was active in the French Revolution. What an amazing guy. And this is all around the idea of how, out of feudalism, do you create a different kind of society that represents ordinary people, the peasants and the workers, who are the majority. They are the majority of the population. And so you have here the peasants, and especially in some countries, especially Britain, the anti-establishment Christians. So these are Christians who are outside of the Church of England. Now, probably many of you are not interested or don't need to know about the Church of England, but you've probably heard of Methodists. You've probably heard of Unitarians, and there are these different kinds of Christianity which are outside of the Church of England, and they were usually peasants and workers who fought for rights and were very democratic. And they supported unions, trade unions, and they were part of the business by which the idea of democracy and rights for ordinary people were emerging in these debates in politics in this transition from feudalism into capitalism. The third one are those who want to end rule by royalty and aristocracy. Now, this was quite widely supported, including by both 1 and 2, because the royalty and aristocracy were at the top of this pile, and they were not making it easy for people to be capitalists or even to be workers and have unions and so on. And, well, you know that people who opposed royalty and aristocracy, what happened in the French Revolution, some of them, not all of them, and so there was such opposition to their rule that they were actually executed, some of them. Now, we also know that that has happened in other countries. We also know in the 20th century, apart from the 2 world wars, the most violent events in the 20th century were revolutions against the aristocracy, based around land. The Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, Vietnam, Cuba, more recently Nepal, all of these were revolutions against the landed aristocracy or the landlords. And they are ordinary people protesting and saying, we don't want this anymore. So there was common support for this from different groups. But what I'm trying to get across here is that we need to understand class in order to understand why these words are so confusing today, because they emerge out of very different definitions of what we mean by freedom and liberalism. And that is the problem. What did he really say? And why is what he wrote still so relevant and controversial? There is in Britain an Adam Smith Institute, which is championing him and which argues only for his argument about free trade. It ignores all the other things that he said, and huge amount of bias in this. So this is his most famous, Adam Smith's most famous quote about the invisible hand. You've probably all heard of this. So this is his argument that the market can solve social problems. But it doesn't work for everything, as we saw at the beginning, with housing, education, healthcare, nutrition, and so on. But he was a much cleverer thinker than that. And this is just a theoretical idea which has been taken to be practical guidance by right-wing pro-market organizations. And all of this is forgotten. So don't read the top one because the language is rather old. Read the bottom one here. Now that's socialism. And yet he's used to promote capitalism at the same time as he had this idea of fairness, which many people would say, I mean, I'm being slightly sarcastic, but many people would say it looks like socialism, or at least social democracy. And he had many other ideas. I know you can't do that, but if you read this Substack, he argued for all these things which were public goods. His was an argument not about pro-capitalism, it was about having a society that promoted the well-being of everyone. It was, okay. But in using him, we have this one which I mentioned, the Adam Smith Institute in London. Ideology, belief, religion. Can you all read it? Is it big enough? Yeah. This one, the Mount Pelerin, it's a place where they had their meetings, and they met only 3 years ago in Guatemala. The Mount Pelerin Society. I'm running out of time, so if you want the slides, then give me your email. Maybe pass around a piece of paper now. I'll send you the slides because these are quite important to read. Even that most precious possession of Western man, where freedom of thought and expression is threatened by the spread of creeds which claim blah, blah, blah. I mean, it is extraordinary stuff. The Liberty Fund is really interesting. It's in the middle of a political crisis at the moment because of its relationship with Trump and other right-wingers. But it's really important because they wrote, I can't remember, I've got it later. No, sorry, not this one, the Heritage Fund. All these in America are making these arguments for liberalism from the point of view of how it benefits their class and not everyone. But they dress it up to make it look like markets will work for the benefit of everyone. So many of them, and they all have offices in Washington, DC, and they're all lobbying the government, politicians all the time. And this one, the Heritage Foundation, this is the one which is particularly in a lot of controversy at the moment. It claims to be a think tank, but it isn't. It's an ideological tank. And they wrote Project 25. Have you all heard of that? Which was being promoted by the Republicans a couple of years ago. Trump says he doesn't support it, but everything he does is out of this. It's like a manifesto for neoliberal fascist government, really. So in the far-right party in Austria is called the Freedom Party. How do these words get used and abused? So I'm going to rush on because I really am running out of time. Individual freedoms cannot exist with rising inequality and biased media, especially social media. It can't work. And this is a nice quote from this professor. Which I quite like. And J.D. Vance wrote this book a few years ago. He grew up in Appalachia, and it's quite interesting because in the book, he argues, which is very common in the United States on the right with Republicans, that people are poor because they're lazy. And if they got off their ass, they could get on in the world. So he describes this as a culture and laziness, not economic circumstance. So he did not believe that the structure of the economy allocated resources, wealth, and income differentially to different groups of people. So he's changed that a bit, but I just want to show this is all very relevant because this is going on in the US government right now. So we've covered all the things that have happened because of neoliberalism. And what you should see is that all of those are new. These did not exist 40 years ago. We have to understand why they changed, and that will be part 2. Why they changed. What on earth happened that the economy was captured by this ideology to create this completely new way of thinking and behaving about life in the world. So that's where we will go with part two on the 9th of December. I'm sorry it's so complicated and long, but you can see there is so much to cover on it. And it's really, really, I think it's one of the most important things that you might ever get at IDS is to understand this. Have you ever covered any of this in your courses so far? Yes? Great if you have. Questions, comments? Yeah. There's a roving mic. Thanks, Kieran.
Thank you. Is there any connection with Karl Polanyi's work? And maybe you can comment on that as well, because we have that in our readings. Yeah. And
Connection between Karl Polanyi and?
Because I thought the mechanism in neoliberal approach is to make everything a commodity. And Karl Polanyi in his work has talked about, has written about a fictitious commodity of environment, labor, and money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, he was writing before the neoliberal project became very widespread. And I'm also not terribly familiar with Polanyi myself. I've not studied his writing. But his ideas, it isn't only neoliberal capitalism that fosters the idea of commodities. All ordinary capitalism right from the start was fostering the idea of creating commodities, which when you make them, enable you to have profit. And you exploit workers to do that. So it isn't the issue of commodities which is neoliberal. It is about neoliberal ideas, is about creating commodities in new ways and using them in situations where you transfer the right to that commodity from one institution to another. So the idea of prisons, the idea of even 40 years ago, the idea that you would have private prisons would be extremely strange. But now the United States has lots of private prisons. And there was even a case 2 years ago where they found that one judge was sending loads of people to prison and the prison company was giving him money because he was creating profit for them. So it's about the way in which commodities are created. So here's the university. The cleaners used to be employees of the university. The kitchen staff, the catering staff used to be employees of the university. So neoliberalism is about how do you cut out a part of that so that we can make private profit from it for a different company that is not the university. So it's not about there being commodities. Capitalism is founded on the idea of creating commodities to sell. It's about how corporations can privatize different areas to make private profits in a new way. Have you come to another class that's starting? We're just finishing off. Any other comments or questions? Did it all make sense? Yeah? Sorry? Yeah.
On
post neoliberalism, I think would that essentially be like the opposite of neoliberalism, or I don't think there's a straightforward answer to that, but it's not socialism, is it? It's like when you look at the main assumptions of this ideology, we also looked at post neoliberalism, which is a whole other thing that seeks to kind of address some of the main critiques of neoliberalism, I believe. So that was interesting.
Okay. Well, the key issue is you had capitalism begins with liberalism and laissez-faire, the right to make profit by producing commodities. And then you have the neoliberalism from roughly from 1980 onwards. What we need to understand is what happened in between. That's the key thing that has to be understood. And what you could say is that during that process, you have the emergence of the idea of capitalism being run for everyone's benefit. Not equally, I don't mean it was equal at all, but you have, I think it's 1906, the first time that the state provided pensions for people. Before that, when you finished work, you had nothing. You had to rely on friends or your family. You had no pension or anything. So this was the idea that there should be some state responsibility for, now it's, I understand why it's so cold. These are wide open. This is crazy. Okay, I'll report that to the office. So we need to understand what happened. And what happened in the 19th century, which we'll cover next time, is that there is increasing opposition to the bad side of capitalism. And you have the beginnings of reforms, and struggles. You have people demanding the right to have unions or the vote, and the ending of things like child labor. I think it was only about the 1860s that it was forbidden for children to be employed in factories and down mines as young as 10. And so all of those things happened in opposition to what was going on with capitalism. And that then becomes formalized in government policy, because a lot of that was what you could call class struggle, civil society, and philanthropists, charities, which began to provide better housing for people. And incidentally, a number of those philanthropists were non-Church of England Christians, especially Quakers. Have you heard of the Quakers? And the Quaker church, that Roundtree, Cadbury's, can't remember the others. So interesting, they favored chocolate. Roundtree's was a chocolate company. Cadbury's still is a chocolate company. They favored chocolate as an alternative to drinking alcohol. So they were wanting to provide alternatives to booze because they were very much against alcohol, as were many of those other Christian organizations. So these philanthropists or charitable organizations tried to plug these gaps which capitalism was leaving around housing, not really very much in healthcare, education. And so then in the beginning of the 20th century, to make it simple, you have the beginnings of the idea that that should be the function of government. So you have the beginnings of unemployment benefit, but it's not until 1948 that you get free healthcare. So that took quite a long time to come through that system. So by the end of the Second World War, 1945, by 1948, you have free healthcare in Britain, which is just quite extraordinary. And that requires taxation. So there was taxation of richer people to pay for it. And that's gone. Yeah. Yeah, take the microphone. Yeah.
No, so the question is, how would the developmental state be almost like a response to neoliberalism and the challenges that come with it? Because if I understand correctly, then under the developmental state, the state forms industrial policy, etc., and does regulate to an extent, but not overextending in industry and the growth and development of industry.
Yeah. It's a very good question. They predate the dominance of neoliberal policies because you could identify them with the newly industrializing countries in the 60s and 70s. So they predate neoliberalism, and they are against neoliberalism because they are about the role of the state in promoting economic growth and development. I don't like to call them the developmental state because basically they're the capitalist state. And if you get the benefits for ordinary people, it's a sideline. And they all tend to favor education because you need educated people to be workers and supervisors. And so they almost all, I mean, South Korea in particular put a huge amount into education. I think Taiwan did as well. Hong Kong, Singapore, they all favor education. So but these are, it's quite interesting because when neoliberalism starts to flourish, the World Bank claims that these state-led development were actually market forces. and they get into an extraordinary ideological twist. Right, how? Yeah, I see you miming the word how. Ideology. They had to be able to pretend that these things happened because of the market. And if you go back and look at the literature from around that time, you have this extraordinary capacity by them basically to tell themselves lies.
That's storytelling. Essentially, that's creating narratives to suit.
You need to.
But that essentially becomes storytelling and narrative creation to fit your ideology.
Exactly,
and not-
exactly. As you saw with the Bhutan forests, everything is created to fit your narrative. Yes. Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
It deserves somebody to do a PhD on the language, twisting the narrative from that period as to how on earth they could claim that the developmental states of especially of East Asia, were actually a product of market forces.